Hello, and welcome to another episode of The Bike Shed, a weekly podcast from your friends at thoughtbot about developing great software. I'm Sally Hall.
And I'm Joël Kenville. And together we're here to share a bit of what we've learned along the way.
So, Joël, what's new in your world?
So this is one of those things that's new-ish. But recently, both you and I were at thougtbot's Summit, which is our sort of offsite event where we get all of us who work remotely and spend a week doing things in person.
Yeah.
And this was held in Amsterdam, a city that is famous for its canals.
Yes.
So after Summit, I had an extra day to myself to explore the city, and I visited the Canal Museum in Amsterdam.
Ooh.
It's one of those places that it's not like a big fancy museum. It's just sort of one of the classic like canal row houses, and then you go in. And the way that they've set up their displays is it's a lot of sort of interactive dioramas. So we'll have a diorama of the city, and then they'll have projectors, and they can sort of project video on top of that or highlight certain areas. So it's a very sort of like multimedia show kind of thing. And I find I've seen a couple of these in a few different museums. And particularly for smaller museums, I just absolutely love this type of display.
Yeah. I love a small niche museum, man. That sounds really fun. What was your favorite thing you learned about canals?
So, thing that was really interesting to me is how a lot of the canals were sort of developed in the early modern period. So after Amsterdam started getting a lot of wealth, they're sort of cramped inside the old medieval city center. And they're like, hey, we've got all these swamps around us. What if we kind of drained them and built these like luxurious neighborhoods that have canals going through them? So it's really a sort of a planned expansion of the city where they got more land, built the canals, and then built these row houses that were meant to be for the wealthy along them. And in a weird sort of way, to me, that parallels the development of Boston's Back Bay neighborhood, which is a similar thing where colonial era Boston is a sort of cramped on this peninsula. There's this sort of stagnant bay behind the peninsula. And at some point, as the city is becoming bigger and wealthier in the 1800s, they just fill it in and build all these fancy row houses for the sort of new money in the city. And now it's a like beautiful neighborhood that people like to go and visit as tourists.
Cool. My question about those, because I have also had the experience of living in a city that used to be a swamp, Charleston, South Carolina. Do they flood often? It feels like with the canals, that's a pretty good drainage system.
Yeah, so you have to have the canals for drainage, but also because you're close enough to the sea, you got to watch out for like storm surges, things like that. In Boston's case, what they've done is they've actually put a dam on the river. And there are pumps there so that if ever the tide raises higher than the level of the water in the river, but there's a storm, and so the water in the river is looking to overflow into the city, they can just pump it upstream into the ocean.
That's awesome. Yeah, I don't know what Charleston built, but when I lived there, the strategy was mostly memorize which roads between you and where you're going are high enough to probably not be flooded today. So the more engineered solutions seem pretty cool.
And part of the engineering that's really interesting is that, again, both Amsterdam and Boston, and I assume perhaps Charleston as well, in order to be more solid in their building in the sort of swampier area, they drive a lot of these wooden piles into the ground, and then they build on top of that. And these are inert as long as the water table is high enough to cover the wood. If the wood ever becomes exposed and there's oxygen, the wood will start to rot, and then you sort of get cave-ins. And so part of the issue is not just not letting the water rise into the streets, but you also don't want the water to go down so much that now the groundwater no longer covers these wooden piles in the ground.
Yeah. I've definitely seen beach houses on not piles underground, but elevated on stilts. So it's interesting to sort of imagine a similar thing, but they're underground.
Yeah. So
Cool.
I got a chance to nerd out on, I guess, a little bit of history, a little bit of architecture, a little bit of geoengineering. Had a great time. If anyone's going through Amsterdam and looking for something that's a little bit more low key than some of the bigger, flashier attractions, I recommend the Canal Museum. So, Sally, what's new in your world?
I have been spending some time trying to figure out why some reports that get generated in this app I'm working on were efficient last year and less efficient this year. For context, it's this project where we built an app that gets used for an annual event, but not really used between. And last year, this like data import task worked fairly well, and then we made some changes since then to enhance some features and things. And one of the changes we made was case insensitive matching on importing. So if I import some records that are for the Boston facility and I type Boston in all caps, it should still find the Boston facility, that's just a capital B. The first attempt at addressing that was using Postgres's iLike to do a case insensitive comparison, which worked great. It found what we needed to find and didn't worry about capitalization. But then when we got into production and we're trying to import 10,000 records at once, that's a lot of slow SQL happening there. So I'm working on, it's too late for this year, but I'm working on trying to find a way that that'll happen faster next year while keeping the case insensitivity. And my first attempt is SciText, I guess is how you pronounce it, which is the case insensitive text column type for Postgres. So I've just been digging into this, but it seems as though it retains the capitalization of the string you put in there, but always searches case insensitive.
Okay.
Yeah. Because one of the things that was hard about, or that slows down the searching using iLike is that our indexes are not case insensitive. So we've got all these indexes that did a great job of speeding up the queries we needed, but then we slightly tweaked that query and now the indexes aren't working anymore. And we're back to slow land. So I don't know, it's just been interesting. I always get excited when I start to try to solve a problem and then remember that Postgres has already solved it for me and I can
Love
just make
that.
it Postgres's problem. So I'm having a good time with that, and a big fan of Postgres.
When you're looking at indexing for something like a like query, is that different than indexing for something like a where or a join?
I think so. And in fact, we don't actually need the like query. We were just using it to get the case insensitivity. So I had a mental step between the iLike query and the SciText, which was just comparing the lowercase version of what in the database and in the search string.
Okay.
Yeah. So I actually haven't done much indexing on looking for, to improve like or iLike queries. That's really interesting, though. I imagine it would be a little more complicated than just a regular index,
Yeah, I was just thinking, like, off the top of my head, I can't remember if you benefit from regular indexes for because you're querying on a subfragment.
Yeah, I don't think you do because it can't, the index is I think you would have to index subfragments as well, right?
It might depend where you put the percent marks too, right?
Yeah, that's
So
true.
if you're sort of indexing, let's say like alphabetically or something, or like in a tree structure that effectively does that, like some kind of trie, and your percent doesn't cover the beginning. So you say, I want a fragment that starts with this and then ends with my pattern. Then maybe you could use regular indexing for that.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's something I'd like to spend some more time digging into and thinking about. I think Indexes just feel like a magical tool sometimes. Like, you can over-index something, but when you hit the sweet spot of indexing it just right so that the queries are usably fast when they used to not be, that's one of my favorite moments in programming.
There's a thoughtbot article that I appreciate that goes over a lot of the common index types in Postgres and when you might want to use them. So sometimes you want to specify specifically index with this structure, this algorithm, because you're going to be using it for certain types of queries. And I think that's a great place to start. It's a good thing to just refresh myself on every now and then, just read through like, oh yeah, this index type.
Yeah. Yeah. One of my favorite gotchas for indexing is when you're doing a multi-column index. So you're indexing on, say, like name and location. The order of those columns in the index matters. It has to be the same as the order of the columns in the query. Because if you switch it, you're not going to get the power of that index.
So this would be the order of the columns in a like where and expression, or like in a select?
I think in the where.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you have to say where column 1 and column 2, not
right.
where column 2 and column 1.
Yep.
That is a tricky
Which feels
gotcha.
weird. It feels like it should be flippable, but it's not.
I guess always run explain on your queries, right?
Yes.
Explain, analyze, and look at those query plans. Make sure that you're actually using your indexes.
Yep.
Sometimes you've got an index and the query planner does not use it.
And then you're just writing extra stuff to your database for no reason.
You just got these almost like ghost indexes that aren't being used.
Ooh, very spooky.
We are recording this on Halloween, so
it is Halloween. Speaking of which, want to tell some dev horror stories?
I'd love to do that. I guess we are recording video now. I should have just brought, a flashlight and just sat around with the ghost face.
I have a lot of random things in my office, but none of them is a Halloween costume close by. So,
yeah. Do you have a dev horror story you'd like to start with?
Sure. My very first professional job as a developer, I don't remember exactly what I was trying to do, but I feel like I had just learned a way to do like several command line things in order, or chain them together. And was trying to do something to either my local environment or staging, but screwed up the command enough that I ended up just dropping the whole production database. The rite of passage. Yeah. And our backup was pretty old. Not super old, but it was like 24 hours old or something. Longer than you needed it to be. But we did have good logs. So I ended up spending quite a while with the logs.
Recreating from logs every transaction, every database transaction that had occurred since the last backup. That's a creative solution, but wow, that must have been painful.
It was very painful. The reason I can't remember what command I was trying to do is because I never tried it again. Whatever it was bad and wrong. But I did learn a lot about the importance of both backups and logs. If we had better backups, more recent backups, it wouldn't have been a huge problem. But if we hadn't had decent logging available, I would never have been able to rebuild all of that. But it still kind of makes my skin crawl when I think about it.
Have you ever dropped a production database since? Or is that your sort of the one and only time?
That was the one and only time I've ever dropped a production database. Not to say I haven't ever, occasionally deleted some data, but never on a huge scale. Yeah. What about you? Have you done the production database wipe rite of passage?
Somehow I've managed to avoid it so far. Wow. So I've gotten lucky.
That's amazing.
I do feel that data-related tasks are always way scarier to me than any code-related tasks.
Oh, yeah.
I can push a bug up to production and, it's a problem. Maybe some users complain. that's not a good thing, but we put out a fix, we deploy it, we're good. But you corrupt your data by doing something wrong, like you run a bad migration or you like tried to run a manual command or something, and some things you do might not be recoverable.
Yeah.
So I tend to be a little bit paranoid anytime you're doing some sort of data migration or even just in planning the schema of your tables, that kind of thing, because it has to be a bit of a measure twice, cut once, because you don't often get a redo the way that you do with code.
Yeah, absolutely. There's not really the same kind of rollback capacity. I mean, I guess in some ways there are, but in general, you're not going to be able to, click a few things and have it go back to the way it was, like you sometimes can with a bad code push.
Yeah. And, make sure you have frequent backups.
Yeah. And that you know how to restore them. If you have that backup, but you can't really get it back, then it's pretty to look at, but...
So I've never dropped a production database, but I have definitely corrupted data before.
Mm-hmm.
And pretty early in my career, I was put in charge of building some internal software that included a time tracking application for the employees of the company to track our time, and that was sort of what we were paid off of. So it's basically a sort of
no
a
pressure
timer,
just everybody's paycheck.
start, stop, and then based off of a few different things, like there were pay periods, and you had to track overtime and exempt status, all that stuff. And then my program would capture all of that, print out a report, send that over to accounting, and then they would pay people.
Yeah.
And I get a message from someone in accounting at some point. It's like, hey, could you maybe check your program, because this person is expected, or it has on your report, they're slated to get an awful lot of money, and that doesn't seem right. And sure enough, I looked into my code and there was a bug there. And I think it was a combination of bugs where somebody had gotten a small raise on the same pay period that overlapped daylight savings.
Mm.
And so somehow, instead of like doing the math correctly, I just double paid this person and their hours counted twice.
Yeah.
And so then I get the message from accounting being like, hey, I think your program's wrong.
That makes me think of the have you seen the 90s classic Office Space?
No.
Oh, okay. Well, part of the plot, not to spoil it, but you've had decades, is this group of programmers who are disgruntled at their job and find out they're about to get laid off, write a virus to steal, like, round off error, like when transactions happen, to steal the like fractions of a penny.
Oh, right?
Yeah. That sort of classic scam. But they screw it up, and I think it's like a divide by 100 thing or something, and so it's supposed to trickle into their account slowly, and they wake up the next day and they've just got like $30,000 or something. So then they panic, trying to give the money back without admitting what they did. It makes me think of that. So it's good that you had a human in there who could intervene and go, wait a second, this doesn't make sense to me. So I feel like there's a couple kinds of dev horror stories, right? There's the ones we do to ourselves that we just mentioned, where, hopefully more often early in a career than late, we make a sort of disastrous mistake. But I feel like there's also the ones that come from non-developer expectations in your company.
Oh.
Specifically,
you're talking things like deadlines, like unreasonable deadlines?
Yeah, or unreasonable expectations. The one that I think of most often is the Thanksgiving I spent trying to help my boss log into the internal system that I didn't understand why he was using on Thanksgiving going to Turkey. And he knew just enough to like delete. I can't remember exactly what. He was having a login problem. And I kept trying to check the status of his user, but he was able to do just enough to make it look like nothing was wrong when there actually was something wrong. So it ended up being a really small, actually, case sensitivity bug again. But because we were trying to debug it over text, him, who knows where, me in my kitchen trying to bake pies on Thanksgiving, it took hours and hours of texting back and forth to figure out what was going on. And all the time, really wanting to yell, just go spend time with your family. We can fix this on Monday. But like, I couldn't say that.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that was the Thanksgiving that was ruined by case-sensitive username matching.
What should have been a relatively minor bug.
It should have. It should have.
Ended up taking your holiday.
It was like cooking with a toddler. They're just helpful enough to make it so much harder. Not that I would compare that person's intellect to a toddler's, but you know, maybe their Rails ability was toddler level.
Right. Is this person trying to like go in and do things like the console and that's messing things up?
Yeah, they kept resetting their password via the console.
Oh, that's tough, right? Because someone's trying to solve the problem themselves and not involve you.
Yeah.
Which is I think a great instinct.
Yep.
The like, I am going to try to be sort of autonomous and solve the problem on my own. But sometimes that can lead you into trouble.
Yeah. Yeah. It's a kind of situation that had it not been a holiday and we had both been, you know, in the office or in our usual remote work setup, probably we could have communicated clearly and made it not a problem much faster. But that happening on a holiday was just the perfect storm of the worst troubleshooting.
I know something I really enjoy doing whenever I work on startup projects is doing things that will empower the more sort of admin team on the client, because they often have very, very poor tooling or no tooling at all. And a lot of things they have to make a special request of the dev team to do things manually for them.
Mm-hmm.
Or sometimes there are things where they can fix them themselves, but it's really painful. So I worked on a project where instead of an admin panel, there was one giant text input with a massive blob of JSON.
Oh,
and the like customer support people got to edit that.
Oh no.
This was a project backed by MongoDB. So basically it was just you kind of get direct write access to the table.
Yeah, so there's not even really the same level of like validation that you might expect otherwise.
There may have been some validation on it, but yeah, it was a little bit dangerous, but also just a horrible experience for the customer service people who had to learn JSON as part of their job to be able to do it properly, and then had to like fight with this form that had I don't know how many hundreds of lines of JSON.
Oh, yeah.
So I took a few days and built them a real admin dashboard of just like, hey, you can now edit users and trigger password resets and things like that, and that made their year.
Yeah, I bet. Doesn't Amazon's like identity management have some fields like that where it's just a big editable blob of JSON? Although that's not a customer service rep doing that generally, so a little more reasonable.
I feel like, to me, the whole Amazon ecosystem is a little bit of a horror story in of its own. Trying to configure an IAM user properly for a project is a labyrinth.
I think it's actually illegal to do it correctly the first time. Like, yeah, you can't. Nobody ever has. Nobody ever will. Yeah.
And it's the kind of thing that I do infrequently enough that it's just navigating through the UI and figuring exactly how to set up permissions and like how can I give myself access to an S3 bucket. I'm just like, no, that's going to be an afternoon. It's just that's what it's going to take.
Yeah, I had some of that this week trying to navigate. I haven't worked on a project on AWS in probably a year. And I've picked back up this once a year support project this week and was trying to get some metrics on CPU usage and database CPU usage. And because the big imports with the case insensitive matching were crashing. And I just felt like I was wandering around in like a warehouse full of other warehouses where everything was mislabeled. And it took me so long. And I never did manage to really isolate what was causing issues via that, and just sort of started going through the like, okay, what has changed since the last time we did this? Git diff strategy of debugging, which was way faster.
Some of that is just, using the tools that you know. But I do feel a little bit of a twinge of horror every time I think about the admin panel side of the AWS experience.
Yeah. Yeah, but I think, one dev's horror story is another dev's exciting project, right? Like, I was rambling about my excitement about indexes earlier. That's probably somebody's horror nightmare of a Tuesday.
I believe that, yeah.
Yeah.
Especially someone who maybe specializes more on the front end of the stack. And it's just like, databases, I pay other people not to think about them.
Or even someone who's just like really experienced in a very different database type.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, another horror story that we're talking about database types was trying to upgrade a Rails app, 2 or 3 versions. It was one of those kinds of tools that was important but didn't change enough that it had gotten fairly out of date, but for security reasons needed to be updated. And digging into it, found that it had been written forever ago, when MongoDB was a brand new shiny thing, and there wasn't really an ORM for it for Rails, so they wrote their own.
Cool.
Which is cool. And it just, never got to the point where the priority was to swap that out.
Mm-hmm.
Or something, more stable. So then we got to tiptoe around that while upgrading several Rails versions. And the moment when we discovered that that was what was happening, when we got down into like oh, that's what's going on.
Uh-huh.
Was sort of like the scary moment in a movie when you suddenly realize like, oh, it's not all sunshine and birds. Something dark is happening here.
Sometimes those are fun on like a debugging mission where you're tracking down a weird bug and you keep going deeper and deeper. And then eventually like you realize what the source of it is. And you're both deeply horrified and also kind of proud at like, wow, it's this like really weird thing that was happening that's like hard to find, and it validates the fact that it took me a whole day to track down this thing.
Yeah. And it can be so satisfying to then fix it.
Yeah. Typically with like a one-line change.
Yeah, that's interesting. Now that I'm thinking about it, as I'm thinking through these horror stories, some of them are mistakes or just like unpleasant situations. But a lot of the horror stories I can think of from my programming experience were also a little bit fun. I'm not really one for a haunted house or a horror movie in real life, but like a haunted code base, that's a good time, kind of. Or it can be.
I did a sort of a bug hunt that was a haunted codes or test suite.
Ooh.
Where I was trying to figure out why tests were randomly failing. So it's a flaky set of tests. And I'm trying to reproduce them locally, and I'm struggling to reproduce them. And then I realized it has something to do with timestamp precisions coming back from Postgres.
Mm-hmm.
So when I get the timestamps from Postgres, which I think have a higher precision than time objects from Ruby, or maybe it's the other way around, then I would get the potentially flaky tests. Whereas if I was getting them just directly from Ruby, the test would pass consistently.
Mm-hmm.
Then started realizing that the tests always failed if the sort of sub-second like decimal portion ended in certain numbers.
Oh, that is wild.
And I forget exactly what was going on, but some sort of like we're taking that timestamp and I think we were then turning it into a string to create like a suffix on a file somewhere. But there was a little bit of transformation that happened. And as part of that, I think it was interpreting numbers as octal rather than decimal.
Okay.
And so it was a weird thing where if it was like cleanly divisible by 8 or something, you would get, it would truncate things in a different way. And then the test would fail because it was expecting sort of the behavior for other numbers. And so that's one of those things where you're just like, wait a minute, it's only getting bad behavior on like sub-second fragments that are cleanly divisible by 8. And then you're digging into it more like,
Which
wait a minute,
sounds made
this
up.
is an octal thing? What?
Like if you came to me and said, I have a bug that happens when the, decimal portion of this number is divisible by 8, I would be like, no, you don't. What is
Right?
that? You've isolated the wrong thing. But no, it sounds like you did.
Yeah, no, and I was able to like cleanly demonstrate, look, I can consistently cause it to fail and I can consistently cause it to pass. And so, yeah, I was able to fix the bug and the test passed consistently after that. But what a journey.
Yeah. Was that a bug that affected users of the app, or was it the kind that only really affects the test because of comparison things?
I think it only really affected the test. You might have gotten like a wonky file name because this was like a file name generation thing. But, if your file name timestamp had like half as many digits as you expected, as a user, you probably wouldn't have cared.
Yeah, I imagine that. Usually we just kind of skim over that and don't really register it.
Yeah. So it wasn't a thing that would have caused user complaints, but it was incorrect behavior. So it wasn't just the bugs in my test. This was a bug in the code, and the tests were catching it, and it was showing up inconsistently.
Yeah.
Again, because it was time dependent.
So I feel like it sounds like at least 2 of our horror stories now have related to the difficulties of handling time, which I think is a favorite topic for both of us.
Yes, indeed.
Yeah. I dealt with a similar bug last year. I was trying to fix it on my very last day on this project. And it was a thing where like I probably would have stayed up until midnight, and because I didn't want to walk away from that unresolved bug. And it ended up being this weird combination of things where we had a controller action that had a round hook that temporarily changed the time zone that was used for queries, which worked fine until we started needing to group things by date, right? Because there are large chunks of the day, large chunks of time every day where 2 different time zones are actually on 2 different dates, right?
Correct.
So if you're grouping by date, you're going to get a different result. Midnight on the East Coast or 1 a.m. on the East Coast on Friday is happening on Thursday in California. And it was so frustrating to track down and so confusing to see, because we were looking for, it was an appointment scheduling situation, and we were, seeing all of these free times in one view on the app, and then you go to be a patient and try to schedule an appointment, and there was like half or less of what you expected. And it was just this tiny little bit of like around this one controller action, pretend to be in a different time zone. It was horrifying and exciting at the same time. Yeah, one of those moments.
I feel like we've talked a lot about sort of some of our own mistakes, some of the bugs that we've encountered, but we also sort of see quite a variety of projects because of our consulting roles.
Mhm.
What would you say is one of the scariest things for you to find when you're onboarding to a new project?
No tests.
That would have been my answer as well,
Yeah.
and that is terrifying.
Yeah. Yeah. I think no tests, no documentation. And then actually, I think the truly scariest thing for me to find when I'm onboarding to a new project is really unhappy developers, right? If the team
Mm,
you're joining, they're all really unhappy and they all kind of hate the code base they're working on. Regardless of what the problems in that code base are, it's going to be worse because everybody's so miserable.
definitely. Yeah, the interpersonal and organizational things are always going to have a major impact on the outcome.
Yeah.
I was on a project once. It was a sort of greenish field project, very short engagement. The client came to us. They worked with a different shop who'd sort of built a prototype / V1 of this product. And then the client wanted us to sort of take it from like really MVP to some more fleshed out set of features. And this was an Express JS project that had no tests. And Express is very bare bones. It's kind of the opposite of the Rails philosophy of batteries included.
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of the things that allow you to move fast in Rails just don't exist, or you have to custom write them, or you have to pull in dependencies. So the code was a bit of a tangled mess, and there were no tests. And so anytime I tried to add a feature to it, things were breaking. And it was one of those situations where it felt like, oh, this is 2 steps forward, 1 step back. And we had a very tight deadline because it was a tiny engagement. This sort of thing was like, all right, I'm going to time box 1 day to try to backfill in some tests and get them to work. And I spent that 1 day and could not get that to work. I was like, I can't justify more time getting tests in here.
Mm-hmm.
And so I had to finish the project out without tests. And that project gave me so much anxiety.
Does that still kind of gross you out when you think about it? That whole project sitting there with tests.
There's a little bit of me that was like, maybe that is the one time where I should have justified a rewrite.
Oh, yeah.
Because the MVP was small enough that I think I could have rewritten it in a sort of test-driven fashion faster than all the other fighting that I did with the framework. Probably in Rails, again, because of the batteries included approach.
Yeah. That's the kind of thing that you often figure out at the end.
Yeah.
The things you know at the end that you wish you knew at the beginning.
And, I'm always very skeptical of rewrites. Like, we love, especially you hand it over a code base written by another team, and you see that, and there's a lot of things you don't like, and the temptation is always like, oh, the other team did it bad. We should do a rewrite. And that's a bad impulse. We should not do that.
Yeah. The other team was working on in a environment you know nothing about. And once you get deep in there, all of their terrible decisions might start making sense.
But I feel like that was a case where I probably could have justified a rewrite.
Yeah.
It would have been tight, right? Because the deadlines were so tight on that it was did I lose so much time fighting the existing code base that I would have been faster to do a rewrite? And I don't have the counterfactuals, so maybe a rewrite would have taken twice as long as I expected, and it would in fact not have been faster, and I would have been better out doing what I ended up doing. But it really felt like coding with one hand behind my back, and I felt like I wasn't able to deliver the outcomes I would have liked to have delivered for this client due to that context.
So how did you handle that? Did you just do a lot of manual testing for every change?
A lot of manual testing and a lot of realizing, oh, this one thing broke something else. And then having to go back and try to fix it.
Yeah.
A decent amount of also QA being caught by the client, which is
Well,
not
that's
always a
good.
good look. It's
Well, I guess
good,
it
but
depends
like
on how closely involved they are and how much you're working together.
it's frustrating for the client to be constantly like, "Hey, thank you for shipping a feature, but you broke this other part of the app. Like now
Yeah.
login doesn't work." It's not a good look that
No,
you're
and it
sort of
doesn't feel
constantly
good.
breaking things. So yeah, scary on first approach when you see that, but then deeply frustrating to work in as a developer.
Oh, I just remembered a really scary thing from before I was technically a developer. I was doing writing automated QA scripts, and this was long enough ago that it feels a little bit justifiable, but it's not. We did not have a version control system. We
Oh,
had a
now that's
remote
almost
team.
scarier than no tests.
Oh yeah. Oh no, it gets worse. A remote team in India, and we were on the east coast of the U.S., so almost no overlapping time. And they would just FTP their code to a server at the end of the day, and it would just overwrite whatever was there yesterday. And so there was no change log, there was no version history. There was just you come into work and there's new code there, and good luck figuring out what's different.
Oof.
Yeah.
I am glad that version control has now just become table stakes for our industry.
Yeah, the idea of walking into a company and having them actively developing software without version control is still terrifying, but seems really low probability at this point.
Right. Right. There's a sense of almost like maybe lack of professionalism
Yeah.
for a team that's doing that. And sometimes you work with teams where like you were saying, you were not a developer at that time. I guess in this case, you weren't the one who was doing that, but maybe you're just new to coding, you're hacking some things. You're mostly maybe a product person and you're trying to get things done. And so that's sort of how you set things up.
Yeah. It's what you know how to use, and it's the tools that you have and are familiar with.
Yeah, and you take them to the limit of what you can do, and then you bring on professionals that know how to work. So that's no judgment on you, right? But at the point
Right.
where you
And no
do move to
judgment on that team.
professionals,
Yeah.
it is good to move to version control.
Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, I just thought of a scenario where you might encounter a project with no version control.
Oh no.
Product person vibe codes an app for you.
Nope. Nope. Just the word vibe codes. Nope. Having to pick up a vibe coded app and do anything with it is certainly one of my fears.
Yeah, maybe that's a horror for the future. I've yet to see that, right? I don't know if this is just a fad or if there's going to be enough of these where there will be a lot of sort of vibe coded projects that have sort of crumbled under the weight of their own complexity to the point where the AI just can't.
Yeah.
And then you go to professional coders to try to fix it for you, and then you realize sort of the tangled web of horrors that is underneath there, including potentially no version control.
Yeah. Oof. Yeah, I mean, I've definitely encountered the gremlin that is mostly an AI generated pull request, specifically AI generated tests. Pretty terrifying. It's like there are a lot of things happening in this file, and not one of them is testing the code, which is almost impressive.
It's like, catching someone who's trying to fail a test to not show that they're smart, but they're smart enough to pick the wrong answer for every question. And you're like,
Yes.
actually, I reverse caught you.
Yeah. It takes skill to do it this poorly. Well, I can imagine in years to come, AI will bring us new and terrifying ways to scare ourselves in a code base.
But hopefully, some of the old horrors maybe fade away, right? Like you're saying,
true.
a lot fewer code bases are unversioned these days.
Yeah.
For a lot of different project types as well, it's pretty standard to have tests now. I rarely see untested Rails projects these days. JavaScript world's a little bit more 50-50, but they are adopting TypeScript, which provides a lot of the same benefits. So, yeah, I think we are in a lot of ways moving in a great way as a discipline. But of course, we also open new horrors to come.
Yes. Every horror is a learning opportunity, and every new project is an opportunity to ruin something in a new way.
With new technologies and also just, on your journey as a developer. Both of us shared stories of like some of the horrors were things we did when we didn't know better.
Yep. I wonder what I don't know now that will horrify me in 10 years. We'll see.
Yeah. So here's a question. Do you think that the horrors just get bigger as a more senior developer because your like scope of impact is bigger?
I think they get harder to fix.
Oh.
Like as frustrating as it was to recreate all of the database transactions from that log, it was pretty straightforward. And when I was done, it was done. But I feel like as a more senior developer, you're making decisions often that touch more things in more complicated ways. And so undoing the mistakes touches more things in more complicated ways.
So like, oh, this took you a couple of days to recreate the database from logs as a junior developer. But as a senior person who pushed for a overcomplicated microservice architecture, it's now taking a whole team 6 months to unwind that. Or you just have to live with it, and your headcount is inflated 50% by what it needs to be for the lifetime of the project.
Yep, exactly. Sometimes I long for the simpler mistakes, but yeah.
Well, on that note, shall we wrap up?
Absolutely.
Happy Halloween, everyone.